components. For instance, by competition culture, we can mean the extent to which key constituencies within a society understand what competition means, understand the basic principles of competition, and understand the benefits that more competitive markets can bring about. So that's certainly one component of competition culture. But also competition culture can mean the extent to which companies are aware of competition rules, and therefore are aware of the conducts that are likely to be in breach of those rules. And competition culture is something that perhaps this audience, this community, may take a little bit for granted, but competition authorities in emerging economies often find themselves operating in a context where the level of competition culture that they face is suboptimal, and that perhaps can make their job harder. So the question becomes, what can those competition authorities do to boost the level of competition culture prevailing in their countries? How should they intervene? And is it only a matter of competition advocacy? Are those the only tools that can help improve competition culture within a country? Or does competition enforcement, the enforcement of competition rules, also play a role? And so to talk about this today, we have three panelists that have actually direct experience with helping competition authority in this respect. So we have Graciela Miralles Murciego. She's a senior economist at the World Bank Group, and her work actually quite often entails assisting competition authorities in emerging economies, helping them improve their ability to be more effective enforcers of competition law, and also more effective advocates of pro-competitive reform. Then we have Christoph Zenger, who is the head of competitiveness at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And similarly to the World Bank, the EBRD also operates in several countries, undertaking technical assistance projects that have the same aim, that of building the capacity of competition authorities. And last but not least, we have Alessandro Tonazi. Alessandra is the Director of International and European Affairs at the Italian Competition Authority. And in this capacity, Alessandra is quite heavily involved in international cooperation with other competition agencies through multilateral organizations, but also as part of technical assistance programs that are aimed at assisting competition authorities in emerging economies. So perhaps the first question that I have for the panelists are, I would say, quite a fundamental one, and that is, why do we care about competition culture? Why does it matter? What does a better competition culture achieve? How does it help a competition authority do its job better? Perhaps, Alessandra, you could start us off with that.
Okay. Thank you. Can you hear me? Because I'm not sure about this microphone. Okay, I'm talking. So I think Salvatore has already introduced the concept of competition culture, which is not easy to define, but I would move from the definition in the competition culture report of the International Competition Network, which defines competition culture as the awareness by economic agents and the public at large about competition law. So this awareness is important because it is true for competition law and probably other parts of the law that it's not sufficient to establish a law or to establish a competition agency to make competition work. And this is particularly true in economies where the market economy is something new, so in transition economies or in developing countries where the ways in which a market economy works is not something that is embedded in the institutions, also in the perception by consumers and citizens. So I would say that there are key constituencies, you said, Salvatore, that are equally relevant, and just to identify some of them, of course, the government and the legislator, because we know that even the best competition agency can find it difficult to work if there are laws that restrict competition, so it's important to have a dialogue with these institutions. I would say the judiciary is equally important, because you can have the best cases in the world, but if the judges do not understand your reasoning, you will lose the cases in court. And of course, the legal and the business community are involved also in the compliance part of the law. The media play a relevant role, so it's important also that you are in a situation where the media understand what a competition agency is doing, what a competition law is. And last but not least, the general public, the citizens, I would say even more than the consumers, I like more to refer to them as citizens, have to understand what a competition law is and how competition works, which ultimately I would say also implies understanding what a market economy does and how it works. And just as an example, sometimes we are witnessing now a time of high inflation, and sometimes the demand might be to regulate prices. And of course, while we understand that there might be short-term shocks that you might want to balance with exceptional measures, it is important if the citizens do not understand that competition can help also in situations such as the ones we are living with, it is then difficult for competition agencies to play their role.
Okay. Thank you very much, Alessandra. Graciela, do you have something to add on this?
Well, Alessandra has already laid the most interesting or the most important elements of understanding a competition culture. But let me perhaps focus a little bit more on the threats, because we know, I mean, the idea was, but how can competition culture actually contribute to growth? And there is no doubt that competition is absolutely critical to growth. Competition policy overall is critical to growth. The problem is that in the past decades, we have seen that market dynamics are actually shaped by increasing market power, especially in digital markets, but not only in digital markets, and an expanding role of the state. This is something that has been exacerbated with COVID-19, and this is something true both for advanced economies and for emerging economies. So what happens when we have to face these threats is that perhaps the traditional antitrust tools are not enough to face these threats. And this is precisely why competition culture is becoming ever more so such a critical complement to traditional antitrust interventions. When I say competition culture, I mean fostering a competition culture as part of the work not only of competition authorities, but also as part of the work of market institutions in general. Another point, just my second point I want to make, is what we are seeing is precisely in less developed economies, because you were mentioning what you were mentioning before, is enforcement always core or not? I mean, obviously enforcement is always core, and we are always going to need enforcement in order to tackle the critical competition problems. But at the same time, what we see is that in less developed economies, competition authorities might not be institutionally independent, might not have the right budgetary resources, might not have sufficient enforcement powers. And this is why competition advocacy becomes so important, because obviously competition advocacy is critical everywhere. But when the enforcement tools are not optimal, competition advocacy becomes even more important. This is something that we have confirmed once and again through the competition advocacy contest that the ICN and the World Bank Group do together every year, when we receive when we receive the experiences of different countries that work on competition advocacy. We work on this with the Italian Competition Authority and with Alessandra specifically, so I will not go in depth on this. Perhaps Alessandra can talk more about that. But the point is that competition advocacy is important in order to foster this competition culture that can help tackle the new threats for which more awareness is absolutely critical. I will stop here. Thank you.
All right, great. So, Christoph, what do you think? Why is competition culture important? Why is that something that we care so deeply about? How does it help a competition authority? You know.
Thank you, Salvatore. It's first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. Big thanks to the organizers for putting together what was really an excellent conference, and pleasure to participate in this particular panel. Maybe I can step back a little bit because I'm not from a competition authority, and frame a little bit what competition culture means for us, how we at the EBRD look at it, because that is certainly shaped by what we do and where we do it. So EBRD is similar to the World Bank's multilateral development bank, and first and foremost we invest in businesses across our region, mostly private sector investments, and we see that this is a big need for these countries, but it's not all that's needed for successful private sector development. So there's also, for example, a skills element. We provide advisory services as well for businesses. But the third element that's really critical is that we have importantly frameworks for markets. And here the bank supports governments and government institutions such as competition authorities to strengthen these frameworks. And so that's where we see competition culture, really this awareness within the wider society about competition principles and the benefits, really as a complementary element to a number of these sort of targeted interventions that we can do, for example, capacity building for competition authorities. Maybe I can tell you about a little bit how we see how competition culture matters in our countries. I mean, I can share with you sort of an anecdotal evidence of the very first complaint that was submitted to a just established competition authority in one of our countries of operations. And there was actually a group of business owners from the same industry that requested a meeting with the newly appointed competition authority officials. And these business owners were outraged at the behavior of one of their competitors, and that's what they wanted to report to the competition authority. And what they were outraged about was that their competitor was selling below the price they had jointly fixed. And this behavior is certainly understandable in a country that carries the legacy of Soviet past, and in fact it wasn't punished at the time by the competition authority, but it illustrates really what happens when there's no competition culture. And so I think from our point of view, competition culture really matters because it is a precondition for competition in markets. So really without the competition culture, we will not have the competitive environment that leads to innovation, to a better allocation of resources and all the all the rest of it. But the second, more perhaps less broader economy-wide aspect, the more narrow one that is maybe more focusing on the competition authority as well, is that competition culture is a precondition for competition authorities, especially the newly created ones, to do their job. And in countries where we operate, a lack of broad support for competition authorities goes hand in hand with underinvestment in the competition authorities' activities. So this morning in the competition authority chairs panel, I was really thrilled to hear about the impressive flurry of activities that are carried out by well-funded and well-equipped organizations. So we see limited resources for competition authorities itself is also a problem because they limit their ability to advocate for the benefits of competition, and that is in itself a viciously self-reinforcing cycle. So while we fully agree we have an issue of under-enforcement in competition in our countries, even though legislation is there now, we don't feel it's only lack of resources, maybe limited independence, but it's certainly also a lack of competition culture that is as hindering, as a stumbling block, and that's why we want to also increase more our activities in that field. Thank you.
And Christoph, in terms of, so you mentioned the former Soviet countries, so is that the main focus of the EBRD in terms of geographical coverage when we are talking about competition work, or are you also active as an organization in other areas of the world? And I would be interested in understanding, so do you have a perception that the issues that you encounter, the problem that you see, do those vary depending on where you operate?
Yes. Thank you, Salvatore. The efforts in terms of supporting competition more broadly in our countries, that ranges across our entire region. So that's Eastern Europe, Central Asia, Western Balkans, and then North Africa. But these are, of course, very different regions from an economic, institutional, but also cultural perspective. And so they have in common, yes, that competition culture is relatively weak, depending on, I mean, it's difficult to measure precisely, but I think that is a sentiment that is probably widely shared. And we can think about a number of factors that drive that, and one is certainly a cultural bias, perhaps also economic structures and state interventions, and then there's a third one, perhaps also the institutional setup. Maybe I can just mention the cultural element that is maybe true for formerly centrally planned economies, where competition may actually be perceived as a negative force, that, you know, one that pits people against each other at the expense of a more egalitarian or cooperative society. So here, you know, the government may be seen as the institution capable of protecting poor through regulation and price control, for example. So that's maybe a legacy that that we can work with. So here it's really about educating the public about benefits of competition, and in particular about the relationship between strong competition enforcement and equitable growth. Because in some of these countries you also had sort of an oligarch class emerging as a result of sort of unfair competition, and I think that is also something that certainly, you know, is also being seen in the sort of collective memory of the relevant countries. I stop here.
All right, thank you, Christoph. And Graciela, the World Bank, I think, has a rather, I think to some extent, it has a different regional focus in terms of the areas of the world where you operate compared to the one that was just described by Christoph. Yet, do you, so maybe you could tell us a little bit about where you operate with technical assistance programs, and whether, you know, the issues that you encounter are pretty much the same as those that Christophe has described, or whether there are differences that depend on where you operate and the specific context that you are analyzing?
Of course. Well, first of all, in the World Bank, we work on competition policy in all regions of the world. Right now, we are working in more than 40 countries. We have different types of projects, different types of interventions, sometimes technical assistance, sometimes lending operations that have a competition component. So we really have a menu of tools and opportunities to intervene and support fostering more efficient market outcomes through competition policy. Now, the way we see competition policy is in the context of our broader interventions. The idea is not thinking about competition policy in isolation, but precisely to try to strengthen competition policy by connecting with other policies, and thus elevating competition policy in the public policy agenda. So we connect the competition policy reforms with the macro reforms, with the SME entrepreneurship reforms, with competitiveness, with innovation, and like that, we strengthen the interventions that we can have in terms of competition policy, and we use it as a complement of our overall programs. So I think this is the first important point. The second point is, when we say that we work on competition policy, competition law and competition authorities, the type of technical assistance that we provide, is only a very small part of our job, a very small part, because this is only the beginning. When you want to think about competition policy in general and promoting more pro-competition sectors, you need to think broader. You need to think about the state interventions, both indirect interventions of the state through regulation, as well as direct interventions of the state through SOEs. And that is why, for instance, our group works on SOEs and competition policy as a single pillar. And in this context, I would like to mention perhaps interesting initiatives that are specifically thinking about this comprehensive way of approaching competition policy, which is the support of the implementation of national competition policies. This idea of a national competition policy is very important when you think about a competition culture, and it's very important for what also Alessandra was saying before. It's about connecting with the role of the state, with the role of other regulators. And national competition policies can be a very interesting tool to foster this type of competition culture, because a national competition policy is precisely an instrument to connect the dots, to make that the different regulators, the different levels of the government are involved in promoting competition in their own sectors. And in this context, I can mention work that we have done, for instance, in the Philippines, in Peru, and this is an interesting tool that I would like to mention. Obviously, we have worked on other types of initiatives, specifically for competition authorities, media training courses that enable the media to be more aware of what competition interventions are about, and therefore report those competition interventions in their own media outlets in a way that all of a sudden consumers read more about competition and are more aware about the work of the competition authority and the importance of the work of the competition authority. We also engage sometimes in surveys that allow us to better understand what is the understanding of the business community of competition, as well as the citizens. And what my colleague was mentioning before, like competition culture is a precondition of a good competition policy. That I need to respectfully disagree, because unfortunately in so many countries there is very little awareness regarding competition. This does not prevent to build up the awareness at the same time that we build up effective competition policy frameworks. But sometimes this really needs to come hand in hand, because it might not exist in so many countries that start with their new competition law or with their new competition authority. My last point would be, in our experience, there is not a one-fits-all solution. Not only every country is different, I would say every sector is different, And it's important to understand the principles that we are trying to promote, but then it's important to be able to adapt these principles to the realities of the country and specifically the realities of the sector that, in our experience, vary tremendously. Interestingly, you might expect that within a region you see more similarities or more complementarities between the types of problems that you see. And in the experience of the bank, this is not always the case. Sometimes we see that a country in Latin America can be a great model for a country in the Middle East. And we have been able to connect that experience precisely to learn from peers that might bring the type of experience that the other competition authority needs. And it's not necessarily clearly connected ex ante, but in practice we see that it works very well. Thank you very much. I will stop here.
Thank you. Thank you, Graciela. So, Alessandra, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what the Italian competition authority does to help other competition authorities as part of, the technical assistance work that the Italian competition authority undertakes, and also your work in, for instance, within the international competition network, so those cooperation efforts with other competition authorities. So what does the Italian competition authority do, and what does that tell you about the typical problems that competition authorities have? Would you agree with the problems that Christophe and Graciela have identified so far?
Yes, okay. The Italian competition authority, similarly to many of what we call the mature agencies, we like to think of us as a mature agency, is involved in several projects providing technical assistance to younger authorities. And this is through both projects on a bilateral basis and within international organizations. We work routinely with the OECD, we are part of the ICN, with UNCTAD, so. But I would like to focus maybe on 3 examples. The first one is what are called the twinning projects. The twinning projects are projects in Europe that are funded by the European Commission, where a mature agency is twinned with a younger one, and provides on a regular basis. Usually it's 2 years trainings and expertise. In these projects we have some events that are called visibility events, and these are events that are, you might say, aimed also at having a better competition culture. So the project is, yes, you provide trainings on enforcement, because, and we will go back to that, enforcement is important, but also we do something broader. For example, recently we had a twinning project with Serbia, and one of these bigger events that involved institutions, not only the competition agency but other institutions, was an event of bid rigging. And we heard before the very interesting presentation by Professor Harrington, and some of the issues were discussed in this event. But the important thing was that in this event the procurement bodies were present, the ministries were present, so when we discussed bid rigging and how to detect bid rigging, this involved a number of subjects that might help the competition agencies in its work. And more recently, we are doing a project with Morocco, and we had the inaugural event, and the inaugural event was an event with the legal community discussing compliance. compliance programs and how to enhance compliance. And again, for an authority like the one in Morocco who is starting because it's been given only recently powers to conduct investigations, this dialogue or this raising the awareness of the legal community is very important. So these are just a couple of examples. Of course, I mentioned before the International Competition Network. The authority has been between 2014 and 2017 one of the co-chairs of the Advocacy Working Group. The Advocacy Working Group has done a lot of work exactly on how to develop competition culture, in particular this project that was called Explaining the Benefits of Competition. The different parts of this project address different stakeholders and collected examples of how authorities around the world had established a dialogue or made campaigns explaining the benefits of competition, which is particularly important. And last but not least, and I'm sorry that Graciela is not here with me today because we were together in this for many years, the Italian authority co-chairs on behalf of the International Competition Network together with the World Bank this project, which is called the Advocacy Contest. It's done on a yearly basis, and all the agencies and other regulators in the world can participate on themes that are chosen every year with good stories about advocacy, so also on raising awareness on competition. And this is a very, we didn't expect really how successful this would be, because it's something where also many countries from developing economies participate and can share their example, and authorities can learn from each other. So it's I would say a creative way of doing technical assistance.
Thank you, Alessandra. So earlier, Graciela mentioned, how perhaps the experience accrued in a certain country can then help inform what to do somewhere else. So something that you learn in Latin America can help you when you are operating in the Gulf countries. So does that mean that, at least to a certain extent, I would say, does that mean that it is possible to have some sort of standardized checklist of things that we should always do when assisting a competition authority, when trying to help boost their ability to promote competition culture? Or rather, would you say that we always need to have quite a tailor-made approach to each situation? So I would start from Graciela perhaps, but I would like to hear from all of you on this.
So obviously there are certain aspects that one needs to understand when, for instance, from the World Bank or any other institution, you start working with a competition authority. But not, as I mentioned before, not only the competition authority, but any other market institution, as we need to be aware that promoting a competition culture is actually something that goes beyond sometimes the mandate of the competition authority itself, and it's good to think in broader terms. I think some aspects can be standardized, but I think to a large extent one needs to adapt to the realities of the countries. Perhaps it's because from the World Bank we work in countries with economic realities so different from each other, and types of countries where the challenges vary so significantly that I tend to be reluctant to a standardized approach, and I think more about how to apply the critical principles and the critical tools that we know that perhaps a competition authority needs, but how to adapt it to the realities of the countries where we do our technical assistance. So that would be a little bit the way. Think about some common principles, yes, certain aspects can be standardized, but in the end, try always to adapt to the realities of the market in the other countries. What I can say is in terms of how to proceed, more from a strategic perspective, I think that pro-competition reforms need really a very strategic approach to be able to be implemented. So, I mean, at the end of the day, when you are working on pro-competition reforms, you are working on vested interests, which are either private vested interests or public vested interests. And many times, what we see is that there might be a lot of regulations that have been put in place, regulations or other types of measures that are highly distortive to competition and that have been put in place simply because it was not understood that this might be affecting competition negatively. So you might expect that, no, when you talk to authorities, they are aware that this has an impact on competition. No, actually, many times, a lot of the regulatory framework that we see, especially in less developed economies and emerging markets, have been put in place without taking into consideration what is going to be the impact on competition. And that makes that this is also part of the competition culture, no? Raising this awareness, making the market institutions aware of the risks of having negative effects on competition and distorting market competition is part of the very important work from a strategic perspective. The other thing is the political economy of reforms, of the implementation of reforms, pro-competition reforms is always a challenge. It's very difficult to implement reforms. And even more so, perhaps even reforms that go beyond the competition law, beyond the institutionality of the competition law. When one goes into critical sectors, highly regulated, a lot of vested interest in that sector, the position of incumbents in that sector, it becomes very difficult. So sometimes it's a question of acting on the weakest monopolies. Going for the weakest monopolies just show that this can work, and the fact that this can work and that can have an impact on prices, that can benefit consumers, that is precisely what brings this awareness that pro-competition reforms have a positive impact in the market. Another point that I would mention perhaps is the quantification of the impact of reforms. Being able to quantify the impact of reforms is important to talk to policymakers and to really make them aware of what are the costs of lack of competition and what could be the benefits of competition. This is about strategically promoting these types of reforms. And finally, I would say one of the critical points is to be able to connect these competition reforms with larger public policy goals. And this brings me a little bit to the initial participation. I mean, being able to connect the work that we do on competition with public policy goals is what really makes these reforms happen. So if I wouldn't standardize so much the tools, but I would standardize a little bit the experience in the difficulties in sometimes promoting pro-competition reform, because there are certain lessons learned that are valuable that comes from this experience, and that obviously it's not only about the work of the bank, it's about the work of the colleagues in the EBRD, the colleagues in the Italian Competition Authority, the colleagues that are in the audience. We all know that how these challenges work and how important it is to be able to meet the challenges and promote competition policy reforms in order to promote competition culture.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. So, Christoph, would you agree with Graciela? So, for instance, is something like the quantification of the benefits that competition can bring about, is that something like, you know, every competition authority should do? And can we, maybe that is something that, you know, is an advice that we can consistently give to competition authorities. Is there something else that is consistent?
Thank you, Salvatore. Maybe also to complement a bit what Graciela said, I fully agree that there's no one-size-fits-all solution for each of the countries. And I think one point that she made that was really important is that also to look at how competition policy and also fits into some sort of broader reform agenda that you might find in a country. Think, for example, Central Asian country with a very strong role of the state and prevalence of state-owned enterprises embarking on a, let's say, state asset on the journey to have a better state asset management framework, SOE governance, but also privatization. So here it's also really important to see the role of the competition, nascent competition authority also in the broader context of these reforms and how they can, how also working with the relevant ministries and government institutions can also be really important to tease out the complementarities here. One point on maybe then using data and also for advocacy and also for the interactions of organizations like World Bank or EBRD with government counterparts is to build the political will also in the countries to have a strong competition policy and policy enforcement. And here maybe one point that is really important and that connects back to the competition culture is that if you have a framework that allows a competition authority a high degree of independence, for instance, then that will provide the competition authorities with the means and incentives to defend and promote a healthy competition culture. But going back also a little bit to what Graciela said, we have a bit of a chicken-egg problem there. So when people and businesses do not appreciate the value of competition in the first place, then also governments are under less pressure to provide the competition authority with the independence that it needs to do its job right. So in terms of numbers, I mean, we have a competition index in the EBRD and track some of the developments, and we find that the level of de facto and de jure independence of competition authorities in our countries is actually such that 90% are structurally separate from the executive, but when you look at a bit more detailed, it's a much lower share that can autonomously decide what staff to hire, how many they want to hire, cannot appoint the commissioners or board members through public and transparent processes. So this lack of independence is certainly something that makes it more likely that the work is dismissed by the government whenever it's convenient. And also public faith loss is also more likely, and we can probably see at the moment in our current inflationary climate that also sometimes governments or media uses the competition authority as a scapegoat for higher prices. So we have heard from our competition authorities that they are accused of failing to regulate prices correctly. So I think there's just a good example of how competition culture or the lack of affects the work of the competition authorities. And I think that's also where then organizations like World Bank or EBRD can come in and break a bit the circle where we can support initiatives of competition authorities also along advocacy or competition culture dimension that they may not be able to conduct with their own constrained budgets.
All right. Thank you, Christophe. I think we are almost running out of time, so I think I'll ask Alessandra another question on another topic that I would really like to hear her views about that. So earlier you referred to Italy as a mature country in terms of...
No, mature agency.
Mature agency. So, okay, that makes more sense
country,
now.
I don't know.
So, yeah, what's the work that needs to be done? How would you regard the level of competition culture prevailing in Italy? For instance, earlier you mentioned perhaps what could be considered the key constituencies in a country when it comes to competition culture, and among those you mentioned the judicial system. So how would you rate competition culture in Italy, and what does your organization do in that respect?
Okay, so that's a difficult question. Well, first let me say that there are three factors that are important when discussing about competition culture in Italy. The first one is Italy had a competition law relatively late with respect to other Western countries, so only in 1990. It had a very strong presence of the state in the economy. And it has an industrial structure with many small and medium enterprises. All these factors, of course, did not provide a very good setting for developing a competition culture. This said, I think, for example, the authority filled the gap very, very quickly because since its establishment, it established a strong enforcement record, which is something I would say it's important for a new agency. It also was very active in advocacy through the many instruments that it has, but so with the legislators. You are asking me a difficult question because we started with the question on how do we measure competition culture in a country? How can we say whether in a country there is more competition culture than in another? There is, we have some means, and also I think Graciela mentioned surveys. There is this survey which is done by Eurobarometer. So thinking of this discussion, I went to look at the results of this survey. I wanted to see, this is limited to the European Union countries, but the result of 2019, Italy was more or less on average. I would say more or less on the European average in this. The question asks how aware customers are of competition rules, whether they know to whom they should address a complaint, and so on. And recently, this year, the survey was run again, and this time targeting not only consumers, but also small and medium enterprises. Unfortunately, the results are not public yet, but I have seen them. I cannot go into details, but I was a bit surprised by the results because more or less on the consumers, Italy is more or less as it was in 2019, so more or less on the European average and in line with countries such as Germany or France. On the small and medium enterprises, where I expected it not to be so high, apparently the awareness is quite high, at least if we can trust the measures of the survey. So this is, as for your question about the judiciary, in my experience, not only in Italy, this is always a very difficult dialogue. And there are, the authority has done 2 projects on training judges. It is, I hope there are not too many judges in the audience. Judges are difficult to train because they only accept being trained by other judges. So this is a difficulty. And of course there is also, at least in Italy, an issue with the curricula in the law studies, because even now many law students are never exposed to a competition law exam. They have very little training in economics, so this is a problem in Italy. I might say that this seems to me to be a problem in many other countries, either mature or immature.
All right, thank you, Alessandra. Thank you all. Yes, as an economist, I would tend to agree that, in terms of well, the level of economic training that judges typically exhibit, as far as I can tell, is not that high, but yeah, we deal with it. So thank you all for your contributions. Now, I don't know if there is any question from the audience. Yes. It's over there, the microphone.
Thank you very much. I'm Teresa Moreira from UNCTAD. That is the United Nations agency, which is the focal point for competition and consumer protection. And of course, I know very well the speakers, apart from you, Salvatore, okay. So nice to meet you. It's also a pleasure to be here. I just wanted, of course, I agree with everything that was said. I just wanted to underline that, of course, because we have 195 member states, and at least 104 of these are developing countries, at different stages of development, and including least developed countries. Of course, we agree that there is not one size fits all, as several of the speakers mentioned, but I want also to bring, especially to the audience that may not be so familiar with the overall global competition community that are the counterparts of UNCTAD, because we are an intergovernmental organization, that we somehow moved from 20-something competition laws and authorities in the 90s of the past century to over 104 countries having adopted competition law and policy. And interestingly also, the model of the European Union and the role of competition as a tool for economic integration and to build a single market has inspired regional economic organizations across the world. But I would just like to mention that several regional economic organizations whose members are developing countries, namely in the African continent, also in Latin America, and in Southeast Asia, thinking of ASEAN, have identified competition law as sometimes an area that they want to, let's say, bring to the regional level, despite national competition legislation, where they want at least to coordinate or work together, which confirms that competition law and policy is, I would say, consensually recognized as a public policy that is extremely helpful, irrespective of the level of development and the particularities of each country, to pursue economic growth and inclusive and sustainable development. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's also due to the work of organizations such as, the EBRD and the World Bank, because they have done a very good job over the past, I would say, a few decades to advocate for, pro-competitive reform and to advocate for the importance of having markets that work and in highlighting the benefits that brings about to the wider society. So. Okay, any other question?
Yeah. If I may complement what Teresa just said, I don't know if you can hear me, colleagues. I would just say that, yes, the work that we have done, we have done it precisely through these partnerships. I couldn't agree more with Teresa's words. I think this is all very true. The role of UNCTAD is absolutely undeniable. And I would like to mention the fact that, for instance, the UNCTAD and the World Bank work together. We have an MOU, we collaborate in several projects, and it's precisely thanks to this type of cooperation that we can develop our mission with more strength. And I fully agree with the point of Teresa, and I just wanted to mention this precisely because, for instance, cooperating with UNCTAD for us is so relevant. We also, as mentioned by Alessandra, we work with AGCM. We have worked in other projects with EBRD, with the European Commission. It's a little bit is the task of all our international organizations and also national organizations to promote competition culture together and through joint networks. Thank you.
Alan Riley, the Energy Community. I think one of the things which I struck, particularly in Central Eastern Europe, in non-EU Europe, which hopefully will be coming closer to the Union. But I think it's a more broader issue, is that part of the trouble is that it's very easy as providing development support to go in and talk in a very technical sort of way, which is important because the technicalities there are very important. But it's also to give the agencies the ability to understand how to build political support and how to build public support. And I think that is actually something which is, I've seen in a number of programs, is difficult to get right. And it's difficult to explain, is that, you know, if you talk about it in terms of governments under pressure with their tax base and so forth, that actually dealing with bid rigging and public procurement, you can actually gain a benefit significantly. I mean, I remember trying to explain about cartel damages claims and saying, this was a conversation I had about the air cargo cartel. And I was saying, you know, Kiev has a huge air cargo industry, and all of the companies who are engaged in air cargo trade have probably been affected by the air cargo cartel. But there was actually no structure, state structure within the state, which would allow you to launch a damages claim in Ukraine. But those sort of things are actually kind of valuable. You begin to understand what can be done. And there's interest. In a sense, that's a very, if you like, easy one. In a sense, the idea will be is that you could sue for damages against foreigners. There's no political issue within your country. In doing that, you just don't have any rules which would allow you to do it effectively. Well, there may be rules, but they don't work. And so it's this sort of thing which I think there are some tricks I think we miss in terms of reaching out and explaining how it can be a real positive politically. We need to do the technicalities, but I think there is this element we sometimes overlook.
Thank you very much. Any of our panelists want to address that?
No, I think this was more a comment than a question, and I absolutely agree that this kind, sometimes instead of explaining through complex technical language, we give some examples which are closer to the interest, which can do much better than a lot of lectures. So.
Yeah. All right, so thank you very much. I think we are really out of time and quite late, and so I think we should stop now for a well-deserved coffee break. I would like to thank you all for coming and thank our panelists. So thank you, and yeah. Bye, Graciela. Thank you.